Hey everybody, Chris here, and today I come to you with another behind the music video. This one is going to be slightly different. Instead of breaking down a particular piece, we're going to be looking into one single sound, and that's going to be my lead synth sound from both Risk of Rain 1 and Risk of Rain 2. Just a little bit of quick history about the sound. It originated back in the recordings of Risk of Rain 1. Actually, it was part of Monsoon and Cyclogenesis, two of the very first tracks I put together back when we were doing the crowdfunding for Risk of Rain 1. And then it was used in many pieces and most prominently in Coalescence. And later on, when I was recording Risk of Rain 2, I was trying to bring back some of the original sounds, and that was obviously one of the sounds I picked, and I use it in pretty much every track, sometimes as a featured lead solo player, and sometimes doing harmonies in the background, because I also introduced some new players this time around. Okay, so we're gonna break down the sound and see how it's made. So let's jump into Cubase. Okay, so we're in Cubase, and what I've done is I've brought in the stems from Coalescence, and here is the lead synth that I'm talking about, so I'm gonna play a little bit of it so that everyone's on the same page. So one interesting thing about this lead is that at the time that the album was released, everybody was confusing this with a guitar. Everybody was saying like cool guitar solo, and I was always replying it's not a guitar, it's not a guitar, it's a synth. And the interesting thing about it is that there is a guitar mentality behind the sound design, but we're gonna talk about that in a minute. Alright, I'll just cut it off, we don't need to listen to the whole thing. So first things first, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna load the sound. I'm gonna do this using the track preset system. So what I've gone into the habit of doing is that I'm cataloging every sound that I use, because sometimes I want to reuse sounds to keep like a sonic continuity, and it's also for archival reasons. So for example, if I come here in the track preset window, if I type ROR, you can see that I have here a lot of my Risk of Rain sounds.
Of course, you won't find every track from every piece of music, because sometimes sounds are used more than once. For example, my drum set, it's used almost in every piece, so I'm not, cataloging it again as the drum set from piece number 1, the drum set from piece number 2, the drum set from piece number 3, etc., because it's literally the same drum kit. So anyway.
Rambling aside, if I type Coal, you can see that I have the Coalescence lead here. This is the version used in the menu theme, also known as Risk of Rain, so the titular track. But this here, titled LD Coalescence Lead, is the latest iteration of the sound. So I'm gonna load it. Now, when we load a track preset, we have our inserts and our sends are also included in our preset. Not only that, but our track settings are included. So you can see that my equalization here is also loaded with a preset, as well as the name, of course. So here we have the name LD Coalescence Lead.
The Coalescence Lead is just the name of the track, but the identifier here, the LD, just means lead. And I use these, for example, if it was a pad, it would be PD. If it was a guitar, it would be a GTR, etc., so that I can search for stuff quickly when I go here and want to find a particular track, especially on big sessions.
So I'm gonna play something. So, we have loaded an instance of Omnisphere and a bunch of audio inserts. These are both equal parts in the sound design. And what I mean is that my sound is not made entirely in Omnisphere, it's kind of half and half. I've built something in Omnisphere, and then I'm doing further sound design using the inserts, and that's also related with the guitar mentality that we talked about. But we're gonna go to the inserts later. For now, let me bring up Omnisphere. Omnisphere is a hybrid synth. in which you can create sounds using 4 oscillators in combination. And these oscillators can be either specific waveforms or there can be samples. And there are different engines that you can use to manipulate them. And it's also a multi-synth, which means that each of those 4 oscillators are part of what it's called a patch within Omnisphere. And you can actually have up to 8 of those patches, and you can combine them either playing together or on different MIDI channels, or you can split them across the keyboard or whatever you want. Now, for this particular patch, I'm using just 2 of the 4 available oscillators. And if I go to layers, you can see that I'm using some variation of a sine wave and some variation of a triangle. We'll talk about that later because neither of those are perfect sine or triangle waveforms. We see that I've activated the solo, the glide, and we can see the range of the bend. So solo means that when I play a note on the keyboard and I play a new note on the keyboard, the last one will stop sounding. So we won't have an interval playing at the same time. We won't have a chord, and we only have one note sounding. To demonstrate this, I'm gonna just grab the camera and go here. So you see that although I'm still holding on the first note, when I strike on the next note, the original note stops playing. So I'm turning off solo just to show you what happens otherwise. And you've also heard a pretty harsh dissonance here, but you get the idea. We'll talk about this dissonance later. It's part of the sound design. In combination with solo comes glide, which is the little bend between the notes. So if I play one note and then I play an interval, the new pitch will come gradually with a glide. In our case, it's quite fast. So take a listen. You hear this whoom, the jumping of the pitch. If I turn glide off, you can hear that the jump to the new pitch is immediate. Now, glide works in combination with this slider here, which is currently set at 0.03 seconds, but I'm gonna exaggerate so you can clearly get an idea of what glide does. I'll set it back on 0.03. Okay, one last thing about the main page is the ability to change individually the pitch bending upwards and downwards and have different values. For example, I can set this to whatever I want. It doesn't affect the downwards bend. And you know that when I play solos, I like to do a lot of bends. For example, I'll play something like that. And I want to focus a little bit on that and generally the technique of playing a solo, because the sound design is definitely an important factor. You want to have a great sound that is expressive, but that's just half the story. The most important part is how you're going to play and take advantage of the expressiveness of the sound. And to me, especially for a nice prog rock solo, you need to be fluid, so to speak, on your pitch bending technique. So I spend a lot of time practicing that, and I also try to practice different values, because when you increase the value here, essentially your pitch bending kind of becomes like a fretless instrument. So if I, for example, set it on a minor third here, because my key is a minor key, I can do bends like that. But the point is that I'm not only practicing where I can take advantage of a minor third bend, but I'm also practicing that my hand learns how to do smaller bends. So not just a minor third, but for example, So I'm practicing things like that to be able to take advantage of this feature and be able to land on the notes that I want to and be able to do expressive stuff. Now let's get to the oscillators. In order to get a better idea of what's happening with the oscillators, I'm gonna actually turn off the audio inserts. In fact, I'm bypassing them. And I'm gonna also turn off the effects within Omnisphere. So this is the effects tab in Omnisphere. As you can see, I have 3 effects here, out of which the 2 are actually already bypassed, so they're not actually used. But still, I'm gonna turn the entire FX processing off. So I'm gonna play now the sound as it is without any effect. It's just the 2 oscillators working. So you can hear that this is a very different sound. It doesn't have all the grit and the texture that the final sound has. It's almost like a sine going towards a square. And to get a better idea of how this is, I'm gonna bring up Supervision, and I'm gonna double click here on the spectrum analyzer, and I'm gonna play a little bit. So you can see here how our sound looks. It's a fundamental frequency and a bunch of overtones. Let's go to the oscillators one by one and see what's going on. I'll turn off Oscillator B and focus on Oscillator A. As we discussed, Oscillator A is a sine wave, but it's not a perfect sine wave. If I play a note, you can clearly see that there are a bunch of overtones when a perfect sine wave would not have any overtones. And this is exactly what will happen if I bring the shape and the symmetry all the way to 0. So now if I play something, now we have our clean sine wave. So I'll bring those back up. It was roughly at half and the symmetry was all the way to 1. And now we can see that we're moving more towards the square waveform. We can also kind of see it here, how the shape has changed from this clean sine. You can see that when I bring the shape over at half, we have another overtone, and then we get this. Actually, there's another thing going on, if you notice, and that's our filter. So I'm going to turn it off. You can see here now that there are a few higher overtones as a result of the change of symmetry, which I'm kind of taking away with the filter. So let's go to Oscillator B now and see what's going on here. So we have our triangle shape, but which is obviously not a perfect triangle again, and another filter again. I'm gonna turn off the filter and play the sound. You can immediately tell that, first of all, it's much softer than the sine wave that we had before, and it's also much higher. So let's see how the triangle actually sounds. I'll bring the shape all the way to 0 and symmetry from 0.35 just to 0, and we can see our triangle here. So we can see that this triangle sounds a little bit more like this shape that we had before. It's a triangle, essentially. So let's bring the symmetry to 3.5. So this is what's happening, and then changing the shape. Now, if you noticed a change in the sound when I was doing that, was that the fundamental frequency actually started lowering and became much softer. And this is exactly what I wanted to do. Essentially, what I wanted to do is when these two are working together, my sine wave is kind of the meat of the sound, like the low end of the sound, and my triangle adds new harmonic content on the upward region. So together they sound like this. Oops, sorry. Let me turn off the filter again, because I'm again. Let me show that actually. Without the filter and with the filter. Again, it's a very tamed sound. And together they sound like this. Okay, so before I go into the FX section, I'm gonna talk a little bit about what's going on modulation-wise. I'm gonna bring up the modulation matrix. Now what you're looking at here, it might seem a bit confusing, but in this matrix we're seeing all the connections that are going on within this patch of Omnisphere throughout all the oscillators. And what you can see here with the grayed out parts mean that are not associated with Oscillator A. So when I switch to Oscillator B, you see that new connections are lit with blue letters. So what's going on here? I have my LFO1.
And don't be confused, this LFO1 and this LFO1 are the same LFO. Omnisphere has 8 running LFOs that you can use in any modulation you want. So these two are the same.
But what they're adjusting is different. So this LFO is adjusting the fine pitch of Oscillator A, and this LFO, again the same LFO, is adjusting the fine pitch of Oscillator B. Now what does this mean? It means that there's a slight pitch modulation, a fine pitch modulation, not grand movements, but slightly microtonal modulation, based on the speed of this LFO. The degree of that is controlled by my mod wheel by manipulating the depth of the LFO. When I move my wheel here, my mod wheel, you will see that this slider here will start moving. And above that, you can see how the fine pitch of both oscillators is starting to move back and forth. So I'm gonna play a little bit just to demonstrate what this means, pressing a key and then bringing up the mod wheel. So you see that as I'm pushing the mod wheel up, I get my vibrato. Now, another thing that happens is that pushing my wheel up opens up the cutoff frequency for my filter, which is essentially making the sound brighter. So in one movement, I brighten the sound and I increase my vibrato, which means that the intensity of the performance is being boosted. So that's going on in the modulation. And let's go now to the effects page. I'll turn them back on. What you're seeing here is two saturation units, because they used to be part of the design process of the sound, but eventually I decided to take them out because I did something different, which is essentially putting the saturation after Omnisphere in the insert section. And I'm going to discuss why in a minute. It's very crucial actually to the sound design. So let's see what the chorus echo does. I'm gonna go back here and focus on the panorama view on the supervision. And we're gonna play the sound. And you clearly see that our sound is dead center. There's no side information in it. Now, when I activate chorus and echo here, you see what happens. When the chorus echo kicks in, our sound spreads and starts having a bit of movement. Both the movement and the spreading, we're gonna sacrifice it when we use the amp simulator, but we're gonna get it back in a later design stage. But the important thing that we're getting here, the chorus introduces slight pitch discrepancies, and the echo, of course, repeats the sound that we get. This pretty much wraps up what's going on in Omnisphere. So I'm gonna turn it off, and we're gonna start looking at our inserts. Now, maybe a brief talk about the equalization here. Now, you're gonna say, is this an overkill having a low cut and another low cut here? This section, it says pre, and that's because this low cut happens before the sound goes into the insert section, right after Omnisphere. 98 Hertz, why not 100, for example, or 146 Hertz, 0.8? I'm gonna explain this by doing this. I'm gonna double click and I'm gonna type G1. And G1 gets us 98 Hertz. What I've done is, instead of targeting a random frequency, I've targeted G1 because my song is in G and because I know that I won't be playing that low. So I'm cutting any rumble that might be introduced either by synthesizer artifacts or by the effects that are applied in the synth. Now, this new equalization happens after the inserts. So after all the processing that I've done, I'm again cutting a lot of unwanted frequencies. And this, of course, you might have guessed, is No, it's not G2, it's D2. Because I'm kind of guessing that G2 might be the lowest note that I might hit, or maybe F2. So I'm allowing myself a bit of leeway, and this is where I'm starting to cut. Anyway, this is a quick note, not so quick, about equalization. Remember the sound out of Omnisphere is this. And with the inserts, so let's actually take a look at our inserts here. So what I have loaded here is my trusty fader, and this, if you've seen my other video about my Desert Island plugins, I've showcased this fader, which I'm using because sometimes I want to do volume rides and I want to automate them, and I'd rather do them on a fader plugin instead of doing them on the mixer fader, because then I can leave the mixer fader for actual mixing. Then I have Roomworks, which is a stock Cubase plugin for reverb, more on that later. Then I have Autopan. Then I have Cloner, we're gonna talk about that in detail in a minute. Then I have my compressor, which is actually turned off. And finally, we have our amp simulator. And if you're wondering why I'm using this stock plugin instead of maybe Amplitude or Guitar Rig or any of these sophisticated plugins, the reason is that I don't really need to. I wasn't looking for any particular tone to emulate. I just wanted this overall effect that an amp might have. And this comes with a bunch of different algorithms, and I tried them out, and the crunchy one is just enough what I wanted to do, and just chose one of the cabinet algorithms. You can also turn the cabinet entirely off if you want. You can see that this plugin has the basic settings that any guitar amp will have, which is the standard bass, mid, treble, and presence equalizers. And then you have the amount of drive and the volume. The drive, as you can see, is set all the way to 10, and the presence is also set at 10. And if you remember before, we talked about how I am applying some filtering in my sound, in my raw sound, and keeping some of the high frequencies, some of the high overtones, keeping them away. And so when I bring this amp simulator, which introduces a lot of new overtones and new saturation and new harmonics, I'm again boosting the high energy by having the presence all the way up to 10. Even so, because of the algorithm, the sound is not particularly harsh, it's not very bright. It maintains this kind of mid-tony guitar sound. And actually you're now listening to the sound without the cloner or without the reverb, so you can hear the dramatic difference. So let's see what this amp simulator does, because it does a lot of things to the sound. I'm gonna bring up Supervision again. One thing that happens when I introduce the amp simulator is, remember that we had this. So a sound with some stereo width, and with the amp simulator we get this. So you see that we gain something, which is all the nice texture and the tone of the amp, but we lose any stereo width that we had. We're gonna reclaim that lost width later with the cloner, but let's now see what's the role of this amp here, and particularly after the chorus echo effect that we used in Omnisphere. So to understand better what's going on here, I want to talk a little bit about an acoustic phenomenon called beat. I'm gonna bring up the Wikipedia page here. So beat is what happens when you get two frequencies, two discrete pitches that are very, very close to each other. You might have heard the sound if you're trying to tune a guitar and you have your note on the top string and then you're trying to tune the string below, and as you get closer and closer to the correct tuning, you start to get this trend. trembling of the sound. This like volume is turning up and down really fast. This kind of fan effect. And the speed of the tremolo is kind of dependent on the distance between the frequencies. I'll have a link in the UNEXIST about this. So what happens when I place this amp is that I get a lot of overtones on my sound. When I'm playing a single note, I get those overtones that introduce a slight amount of texture and color to the sound. But where the beat effect is applied is when I'm moving from note to note. So try to listen to what happens in the transition from one note to the other. If you notice that there's a kind of growling that happens, the texture is increased essentially because we have clashing frequencies on the higher end of the frequency spectrum. And what actually happens is that a lot of like micro beat effects taking place during the transitions, because we have one note, we have a new note, we're gliding into this note, we have the echo of the previous note falling with the new note, and we already have these notes being chorused, so subtle amounts of beat effects piling up and creating this growling. It happens only between the notes, but it brings a ton of expressivity. I'm gonna do something here. I'm gonna turn back the solo so you can hear this growling in effect at all times and not just in small little intervals. So listen to this. You hear this crazy growling that is going on? This is because of all the clashing frequencies. In this particular case, I played a minor third, and the overtones that are created by the minor third are very different. They're not coinciding. Instead, if I play an octave, the growling effect is much more attenuated. It's not as intense because one note and its octave share a lot of overtones. Again, if I play a fifth, a perfect fifth, we get a quasi-harmonious sound. It's still growling, but not very aggressively to our ears. Not dissonant, but it's still textureful. But again, if I play a minor third, or a whole tone, or even a minor second, here we can clearly hear the volume going up and down and this tremolo effect, right? So essentially, what I'm doing by putting the amp after the chorus echo and by having a sound that utilizes glide is that I'm doing these micro growls between every note that I'm playing. And this is the fundamental part of this sound and how it gets its expressiveness, so to speak. Okay, so moving away from the amp, let's get to the cloner, which is kind of a sophisticated chorus effect with a little bit more control over the sound. And this is how we're gonna gain our stereo width back. So, without the cloner, and with the cloner. You can probably hear it if you're using headphones or have a nice set of studio monitors, but you can also see it here on the Super Panorama. We have a bit of our width back. Now, let's take a look at the cloner real fast. We see that we can choose up to 4 voices. So together with our original voice, we can add up to new 4 voices, which can be a little bit detuned. This is the amount of detuning, and this is the general amount of detuning. So from the 69% of overall detuning, we get these discrete amounts per voice. So you have nice control over that. And then you have a little bit of delay. So not all of your voices start at the same moment. And then finally, you have this stereo spread, which is controlled by this knob here, the spatial knob. So I can have it, all my voices be in the center, or spread them really wide, or have them something like that. And then I can have my mix, which is now at 20%. I'm now listening just to the effect of the cloner. You can see I had it roughly at 20%. So my main voice is the one standing out, and then I have the other 4 voices reclaiming my stereo width and also giving me additional discrepancies in pitch. The thing is that these new pitch discrepancies happen on top of the amp and they don't feed the amp. So they are not really introducing harshness and growling into the sound. They're just repeating the already existent growling. And that's because this is kind of a linear effect and the amp simulator is kind of a non-linear effect that's kind of goes beyond this video. But anyway, final thing, this room works. This is a reverb. Again, I want you to pay attention here and listen for the stereo width. So we see that when we bring up the reverb, besides the forward sound that just attacks us head on, we also have a feeling of spreading on the sides. The mix is now at 32%. I think that's a bit too much generally, but for Risk of Rain, which is kind of old school prog rock and space sound, this is kind of part of the design. And the reason that I have this as an insert and not as a send effect is because I consider this as part of the core sound and not like an additional effect that I'm gonna apply later on based on the mix. Of course, when I'm doing the actual mixing and I'm finalizing a track, I might come here and reduce it or increase it or what have you, depending on taste. I don't think that the settings that I have on my reverb are very crucial. You can see that it's almost at 3 seconds, which is a mid to large effect, depending on how you see it. The width, as discussed, is at 100% because I want to add this spaciousness and lushness to it. A little bit of diffusion and stuff. You can actually see that my highs are at a pretty low, 10% here. This is the damping. And this means that my highs are rolling off way faster than my lows. Because I don't want to have this harshness and brightness on my reverb. I want it to kind of hide away pretty fast and just be an openness instead of a particular sound that you are focusing on. Maybe a quick note about the Autopan, because it's an effect that I do utilize often when I'm using the sound. It's turned off by default, but I very often will turn it on. So without the Autopan, and with the Autopan, I kind of exaggerated there. You also see that when I'm using the Autopan, there's a volume drop, which I will obviously compensate later on. And I think that this is pretty much it. So again, 2 basic oscillators, chorus echo, a guitar amplifier to add distortion and exaggerate the overtones, cloner to bring back the width and make it a fuller sound, some reverb to bring it to life and make it more lush. That's it. It's not a very complex sound. Literally, the secret sauce of it is having the distortion after the echo and the chorus. Okay, so that was pretty much it about the sound, but one last thing that I wanted to do is mute my original stem here and jam with the music, just for the fun of it, just to see what's gonna happen. So, engage. Okay guys, so that was it. I hope you had fun and learned something, and perhaps try out these techniques on your own sound design, either for leads or whatever sound you want. If you want to support me, you can expand the UNEXIST and click on one of the links that takes you to my Spotify or my Bandcamp or whatever. And if none of these places are suited for you, you can always listen here on YouTube. And I'm gonna see you on the next one. Actually, it's not going to be very soon, because I'm now working full-time on the hope to bring you some music that you can enjoy. So yeah, that was it, and I'll see you soon-ish. Bye.